Station 51, Engine 27, Engine 32, Truck 105.
You're listening to The Fire Break with Steve Wolf. Welcome back to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing innovative technologies using jet engines and AI to fight wildfires. I've got the amazing Dr. Katharyn Duffy with us today. And Katharyn is an expert in, I'm going to say, in all things carbon related, but I'm probably overstating. But nonetheless, welcome to the show, Katharyn. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Steve?
I'm good. You know, when we talk about wildfires, one of the problems that people cite related to them is the tremendous amount of carbon released by them. And I'm not sure whether, 20 years later that carbon is all reabsorbed, in which case the net effect is nothing, or if the fact that it's hanging out in the atmosphere until it gets reabsorbed is problematic. What do I need to know about that?
Yeah, so I started this research, a large body of my research is around wildfire carbon interactions and how we understand those interactions, both through unplanned disturbance like wildfire, maybe drought, maybe climate change, but also how we measure that against planned disturbances like treatments, prescribed fires, things like that. So I started this research about 15 years ago, and at the time, people were really focused on the actual fire itself and how that actual fire, like the emissions from that actual fire. And what they were really failing to picture, absorb, think about was the whole bottom. That's the top of the iceberg. Okay. Really, that whole bottom part of the iceberg is, especially in high severity fire situations, you have a delayed regeneration of that forest. And then often, especially as we have increased aridity, as we have larger patch sizes of high severity fire, there's a lack of seed source, right? So there's a lot of drivers sort of questioning whether or not that forest comes back. And sometimes we see a succession to an alternate ecosystem, something like a sagebrush grassland. And that type of ecosystem sequesters and stores less carbon, both in the actual woody body of it. Forest carbon is really about what's stored in a bowl or a stem of a tree, with some underground carbon storage and soil deposition. But when you think about a transition from a forested ecosystem to a sagebrush or grassland ecosystem, that's actually a really big sort of tipping point in the ability for the terrestrial biosphere, forests, ecosystems to store and sequester carbon. And so 15 years ago, people were really focused on that upper tip of that iceberg, failing to consider all these downstream effects. And what we really find in the evolution of the data in the literature is that fire itself is maybe about 20% of the total impact on forest carbon, that 80% of it is that iceberg underneath the surface, that longer term downstream effects that come from high severity fire.
So you're saying it's worse than it sounds.
It's worse than it sounds, and it's getting worse as we see more frequent, larger, and more high severity fires, and we have increasing aridity where the survival. So even if there is
aridity
a pulse,
is dryness. Yes.
Oh yeah, sorry, aridity is dryness. So one way to think about it is how spongy is the atmosphere? How grady is it for water? As we warm the atmosphere, it actually wants to pull more and hold more moisture in itself instead of like giving it to plants. So plants are sort of almost in an ever increasing drought situation, even if we're not in a drought.
Okay, because as it gets warmer, you have more evaporation from the plants and less of a tendency of the atmosphere to return that moisture.
Yeah, exactly. So if you heat up the atmosphere, there's sort of like, it's pulling that water out of the trees because they're trying to sort of equilibrate the atmosphere with what's inside their leaves or needles, things like that.
I can guess who wins that battle.
Yeah.
I see. So are we going to see, so is this going to act as an evolutionary force against plants that require more water? And we would see more of a growth of plants that require less water?
Yeah, so there's different types of photosynthesis. You can tell me if I'm getting too nerdy because I'm a scientist, so I can do that.
Nerd out here.
Okay, so there's different types of photosynthesis. And one of the types of photosynthesis is actually around concentrating, basically the Krebs cycle, like concentrating that so that you actually release less water to the atmosphere. So grasses do this.
Okay.
The problem is that trees have this other form called C3 photosynthesis. They don't really get to regulate outside of just saying like, stop, I don't want to lose any water, but I also don't get to absorb CO2 when I do that. Right? So when trees or C3 plants are in a droughted condition, they sort of regulate down their stomates so that they can't actually get CO2 in, but they're doing it because they don't want to release water vapor to the atmosphere.
Okay. Right.
But to your point of,
I close my mouth, I can neither breathe nor drink.
Yeah, it's like holding their breaths.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
But to your point on, is this going to be a like evolutionary or ecosystem pressure? Yes. The problem is that plants aren't like animals, right? They don't get to get up and move around and like figure out which climate space or which like drought condition they want to live in. There are these they can transition over decades to centuries, but they don't move in the way that animals do, say when phenology is changing, which is the timing of greenness. Deer or elk or something like that, they can sort of move around and find a more optimal food source. Plants don't move as quickly.
Yeah, we don't see a lot of plant migrations around here.
But I mean, what's really interesting is that I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, and we're right on the edge of the Mogollon Rim, kind of gateway to the Colorado Plateau. And as you go up and down that plateau, you can see that sort of gradient of ecosystems and dryness. And one of the places where we see this movement of plants or the mortality of existing vegetation is along those elevational gradients because of that temperature gradient associated with it. So people always, when I tell people I live in Arizona, they assume that it's all cacti and desert. And I live in one of the largest ponderosa pine belts on the planet, right? And that's because Flagstaff is at 7,000 feet base elevation. And so as we are warming, what's really interesting is watching some of those ecosystems move up in their elevational gradients. And the problem, though, is that then you get to the top of the Mogollon Rim. And now all you have is these sort of mountain islands for ecosystems to move into. And so a lot of my work has really been around understanding the drivers of ecosystem productivity or failure. And like, is that water? Is that sunlight? Is that temperature? Things like that. But also the role of disturbance and how we can, as humans, as a part of the terrestrial biosphere being the Earth system that involves living things, we're actually part of it, right? How we can actually play a role here and how we can proactively address some of the stresses on ecosystems that actually retain the really essential carbon sink of all of those land plants. Because essentially right now, forests and other ecosystems, largely forests, but also other ecosystems, are basically giving us a 20% discount on our carbon emissions, right? Because they're saying, oh, good, there's like more CO2 in the atmosphere. I can use that. But they're living, breathing things, right? That have to sometimes hold their breath when they're under stress. And so that essential sink of the terrestrial biosphere, that's in question as we like keep warming, keep on throwing more and more high severity fire. All these things are related. And a lot of my research has been around how do we know what's too much? And how do we know what to expect? And how do we proactively address that?
Yeah, and of course, on any given square mile of land, the amount of carbon that's sunk into biomass varies dramatically. And I would imagine it's higher in the areas where moisture content is greater, right?
Exactly.
We look at an Amazon rainforest, there's a lot of water available and a tremendous amount of growth and carbon sink. When you turn that all into a more arid climate, you have a lot of sand and occasional cactus, and that's probably not the best carbon sink.
Right, exactly. So there's a reason why a lot of people refer to the Amazon as the lungs of the earth. Super productive, lots of nutrients, lots of water. It's kind of not limited by anything except for temperature.
I see. So as temperature goes up, it cooks off some of that water.
And as temperature goes up, so if you think about an ecosystem or a tree as a human body, right? We have an optimal temperature. So if you have a fever, right? your body starts to not work as well. The same is true for plants, trees, ecosystems. There's some sort of optimal temperature window that they've evolved to live within. And as we move outside of that temperature window, it starts, like, ecosystems have fevers. They become kind of stressed. And that ability to even do the act of photosynthesis gets harder and harder. And it's a combination of water, temperature, all these things.
So I'm guessing over time you would see some phenomena where the conditions change, and maybe if they change drastically enough, 1 or 2 out of every 1,000 plants in that area somehow is able to survive, and then over time that becomes the dominant plant in that area.
Exactly, that kind of slower, one way to think about climate change and temperature change is, so there's stochasticity, and I want to talk about this, but it's kind of this like slow moving increase of the base, right? Where even in a wet year or a cooler year, that is still like creeping up and up and up. And so it's almost like the lobster or the crab in the pot, right? The pot keeps getting a little bit hotter, and eventually it's like, oh, I can't take it. But it's not always like a immediate mechanism. But then what you do is you lay on top of that wet years, dry years, hot years, cool years, all this stochasticity that's happening. It's part of natural variability, but it's happening on top of that ever creeping up temperature or aridity, lack of water, things like that. And so then you start to see this pulsiness, right? So in, 2015, I want to say, that massive drought in California where we saw sort of mass mortality in that ponderosa pine belt at the base of the Sierra. So temperature had been creeping up, but then we had a really dry year. Then we see that mortality event, which is persisting from a remote sensing and survey-based data. And I think the interesting thing that leads us back to fire in all of this, why are we talking about plants and like evolutionary pressures? Well, because now all of those dead trees, they're nice, dead, dry fuel for fires, right? And so here's where we get to see the sort of earth system, drought, all these different dynamics. How does that play out into fire risk? And what might we do to both address sort of ecosystem stress, forest stress, to avoid the worst effects of drought-induced mortality, but also what can we do once we have one of those mortality events? How might we think about how to restore that ecosystem? What plants or trees or ecosystems are likely to survive in that area now and into the future? When we think about something like a 20-year stewardship agreement, we need to think about that 20 years of which ecosystems we want to restore to, and what sort of mitigation, can we do mulching? Can we do biochar? What sort of things can we do for this ecosystem such that it is more likely to be retained in the future?
I see. And so if you have a die-off of trees pre-fire, then you still have an opportunity to capture, to maintain that carbon capture, because even a dead tree is, mostly carbon.
Yeah.
By weight. So the trick is, once it dies, harvest the lumber and do something with it, right? Because lumber is in my thought, and you'll tell me if I'm right or not.
Yeah.
But I think that lumber is the world's most efficient carbon capture technology.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So first, you're completely right. Basically, for rough math, you can just think of half of a tree's biomass, like the body of it, is carbon, roughly half. And a really efficient way to capture that is to do sustainable forestry, sustainable logging, especially when you have a mortality event from beetles, drought-induced mortality, post-fire salvage, right? These are ways to actually go grab that carbon and that biomass and say, let's put it in long-lived harvested wood products, like the house that's sitting around me, probably around you, or buildings and things like that. We can actually sort of sequester and store that in longer-lived products. There's a spectrum there. You can make paper or pellets, and that carbon's not stored as long, but you can make, saw logs and and timber and board feet, and those have a longer residence time. So we get to kind of store that, right? And so there's a lot of opportunities to sort of work with the natural disturbance, the disturbances that these ecosystems have evolved to live with, and say, oh, but we're trying to mitigate all of our emissions to the atmosphere. How can we start thinking about forests as one of the most efficient carbon sequestering machines on the planet? Like, listen, it had a couple billion years to figure it out. Right. It's better than anything we're going to come up with, right?
Yeah. So when I look at the startup space and the climate tech space, you see a fair number of entities, claiming that they're going to do some form of carbon capture, suck carbon out of the atmosphere with some technology, and that sounds so ridiculous to me when I think no technology could be as efficient as planting a tree. It's solar powered. It runs on wind, sun, air. Right? You plant it and it just sucks carbon until it's fully grown. Mm-hmm. So I can't imagine that there could be any man-made technology that could be more efficient than that.
I'm a little biased because I study forests, but I'm with you.
Yeah.
I think it's hubris.
That's only second to carbon credits in my mind.
Yeah, I think it's hubris to think that we can outthink billions of years of evolution.
Right.
Plants figured this out. They've actually, to just minor nerd dive, the first plants were actually stromatolites. They actually lived in warm, shallow oceans, and they figured out photosynthesis. And then they got onto the land, and basically plants were like, we got plants that were like, oh, wow, there's all of this CO2. We can use it. It's food. And then, now we have this amazing array of plants with different evolutionary strategies and ways to do that, ways to not be impacted by drought. Cacti have their own version, all these things. But to think that humans can engineer a machine to do that as efficiently, I remain unconvinced.
Yeah, right. It's come about as far as the artificial heart.
Right.
Yeah, but not too far. So when we talk about, or when you hear, environmentalists, out of the best motivations, but talk about, save the earth, and the planet is dying. Like, okay, well, the planet is a big rock. Right, the planet is not alive in the first place. It's this thin film of stuff on the outside that's life. So when we talk about save the earth, we're really just talking about the life part, right? Where the rock's survivability is not in question here. Right? Yeah,
the earth will keep spinning. The thing about climate change is, do you know who it impacts the most? Us, humans.
Us. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. The earth is going to keep spinning. The Earth has gone through multiple mass extinction events, and there's still life on this planet. It's really, do we want healthy economies and communities and things like that? Then we should care. We should care about climate change and its sort of acceleration of disturbances that affect us. Selfishly, this is the argument I make to people that say, I'm like, well, do you have children? Do you have cousins or parents or, grandchildren, or we're really talking about them having a high quality life into the future. And the world is going to keep spinning. The world doesn't care that we're instigating this massive change.
Right. I mean, a massive die-off of humans might be, the best thing that could happen for life on the planet, because we seem to be the largest force contributing to the demise of other species.
Well, I think what's interesting about humans, and again, I don't study humans, but this is just how I think about it. What's interesting about humans is that we're the first species who's figured out how to go grab carbon from 250 million years ago, dig it out of the earth, and light it on fire. There are geologic processes that do this, right? But they do it over really long time spans. We figured out how to go find that stuff because it's full of energy, light it on fire and be like, oh, actually, let's put that back up. And so into the atmosphere. So this rate of change is quite different with humans. Would a mass extinction event benefit us? I don't know. That's it's too morbid. I have a child myself.
Not benefit us, but it might benefit the remainder of the species and plants.
Well, I do think that we should, back to something I said earlier about the fact that we're a part of the biosphere.
Yeah.
I think we often forget that. We're a living part of the Earth system. You know, when you remove like a predator from an ecosystem, like, okay, when we removed wolves,
Right.
there's an overpopulation of deer.
Right.
We need to think about that dynamic with ourselves, right?
And the deer overgraze, and then the rivers get, right.
Right. Yeah, because like when there's an overpopulation of deer, then there's a lack of food and there's scarcity and there's like, you know, impacts on health. We need to think, I'm not saying that we need to add wolves, you know, like, I don't know, what's the equivalent for a wolf here? We've done a good job of like beating our top predators. But what we need to do is think about population dynamics for humans and think about ourselves as a part of the system. What's a responsible impact? What's a responsible use of resources? How do we actually see ourselves as a part of forests and disturbances, especially as we build further and further into the WUI, the wildland-urban interface? And how do we see ourselves as part of this and ask ourselves, what's responsible? What's responsible for like both ourselves right now, but the multiple generations that hopefully, fingers crossed, come after us, right?
Right.
What is the impact of our actions today?
So I imagine as a scientist, you are, you know, heads down, observing what's going on. And to some degree, possibly dispassionate observer, right? You just say, well, this is what's happening and these are the likely consequences of it. And then it's up to philosophers to decide whether this is good or bad. But you can obviously foresee the impact on future generations. What's your thought on how optimistic are you about human ingenuity as a offset to the impacts of human greed?
Yeah, well, I'm going to back up a little bit and say, yes, I have published a couple of those papers. The like waving a white flag and saying, hey, this, you know, the sink of the terrestrial biosphere that we count on, that's not guaranteed. And here's the mathematical limits of that. And
Right.
kind of wave a flag and say, hey, let's pay attention. And, you know, that actually got a lot of pickup and press. I was actually really surprised by that, how many people were just flooded social media and they heard it. And I was like, oh, wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
But I actually don't really like writing doomsday papers. It's like not that fun for me.
Right.
You know, when I see math or statistics or like clear asymptotes or tipping points in the Earth system, I want to tell the public. But this question, okay, like this kind of dispassionate observer, like, hey, I'm letting you guys know. That doesn't necessarily, like, that doesn't feel like enough to me to just say, hey, guys, there's a cliff over here. So that's part of why I am both affiliated with Northern Arizona University, the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems, and a startup called Vibrant Planet. And this is exactly why I said, you know what, climate and disturbance and drought and all this stuff, if I don't move more quickly, if I don't get my science into the hands of people who can use it, we don't have a chance.
That's right.
Right? And so that's when I transitioned over to the startup space and built a whole team of scientists and all of us joined because we said, oh my gosh, how do we get other people our information where it's not locked in a publication behind a paywall? It's not hard to find. Like, how do we actually put the information and knowledge and data that we're generating into the hands of people who can use it? And that is what my team does.
Where they can understand it.
Exactly.
And be motivated by it, right? Which, you know, people respond to a why more than a what. Yeah,
because, you know, what's really nice is that I can generate some data, but there's awesome engineers that are going to put it into a whole cloud-based system. And there's product people who can say, here's a human translation of what that thing means, because scientists can be a little bit opaque sometimes.
Maybe. Well, you know, right. I mean, among the wolves that were introduced, you know, that have had an impact, you know, certainly Allison Wolf would be one of them.
Yes. She recruited me, she and Scott Conway, who founded Vibrant Planet, along with some other people at the executive team level. And I think what's really interesting to me about our executive team is, for a lot of them, this is not their first rodeo. You know, these are people that were on the base floor of Lyft and Facebook and Netflix and things like that. So they have a lot of that. How do we take technology and user experience and like accelerate something. And a lot of these people were directly impacted by some of the wildfire crisis that's hitting the West. And they said, oh my gosh, we have to do something. And so vis-a-vis Vibrant Planet.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's certainly new ways of thinking about, wildfire mitigation now that don't necessarily involve, cutting, trimming, and mulching.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, running a mulcher's got to be one of the dirtier machines out there in terms of emissions. Right?
Definitely.
We're going to cut down these trees that have carbon in them, and we're going to grind them up in this machine that generates tremendous amount of carbon.
And then we're going to expose all that carbon to all the bacteria and fungi and all those happy little microorganisms that are going to turn that into carbon emissions.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, while turning a tree, which has a very low surface area to volume ratio, into mulch, which has a very high surface area to volume ratio, and therefore way more flammable.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
So, well, good intentions, right? So one of the areas that's being explored is just chemical treatment of areas, with an increasing focus on safer chemistries, salt-based chemistries, rather than phosphorus chemistries that could treat vegetation without damaging it and render it less flammable. But a lot of the chemistries that are being dumped on fires, impact the soil composition. Right? You dump phosphorus over, huge areas, then you're creating phosphorus-rich soil.
Right.
And phosphorus-rich soil is not the type of soil that the native plants evolved to grow in. And then as a result of fighting that fire, you've now changed the soil composition to where the native plants won't grow there. Something else will grow there, and it's probably more flammable.
Right. And so what you're talking about is also a related driver here is where that soil, say pH or nutrient balance changes, where there's a lot of stress, where there's a lot of disturbance. We're seeing actually in the West a lot of invasive species that are highly flammable. Species like cheatgrass, right? Where they have this whole evolutionary strategy where they're going to green up really early and then brown down and be really flammable, right? Yeah. And so cheatgrass is doing a great job of outcompeting natural grass, as an example. And so I kind of think that there's a place and time for probably most of our current interventions. What we really have to think about is, why do I want to put this intervention here? How does it actually protect some other strategic asset or resource or something like that I care about? Maybe it's a community. Maybe it's an essential power line or an essential reservoir. Well, I'm going to think about the treatments that I place to protect that thing differently than actually truly restoring a functional relationship between forest and fire out in the wilderness or out, away from human assets and resources. That cost benefit, we really need to think about that carefully. We need to think about not just the forests or the carbon, but we need to think about how that relates to roads, power lines,
right?
Everything else that we need in order to survive on this planet, in our communities, be healthy, etc.
So we're focusing on the built environment, essentially, right? So to what degree do you think we could reduce the overall fire mitigation army and allow restoration of the natural balance of fire within the ecosystem if we were to draw back our resources and say wildland firefighting's purpose is just for asset protection? Roads, power plants, hospitals, community centers, schools, neighborhoods, and the rest of it we let nature restore it to a more natural balance.
I think that's a great question. I think that clearly, and like any statistic I would cite here just like changes the next year, right? First, let's talk about the cost of fire suppression versus restoring functional relationships with fire, right? In the early 1900s, we were like, oh no, fire's bad. And we had no idea what we were doing through actually removing, back to that predator relationship, fire is a predator. in forests, and it was helping to retain this natural forest structure, natural rates of, say, carbon storage or ecosystem habitat, things like that. We removed it, and now we're in this place where when fires occur, they're often so high, like such a high severity behavior that just letting everything burn is also not an issue. It's often not a solution. But what we can do is figure out, where can we actually already allow fires to burn, right? Have a resource burn. Where can we institute some prescribed burn? But where do we need to do some of that mechanical removal, like something in order to decrease that fire severity, such that we can now say, hey, we're not going to suppress every fire. We've been doing fuel treatments. We've been doing ecological restoration. This can be a functional fire. And a functional fire does not always mean a low severity surface fire. It's patchy. It has variability. But so that, that's, if we can do that, people look at the cost of treatments and they say, oh, that's so expensive. Like, we don't have the funding for that. Well, let's look at the expenditures on fire suppression. And I'm not saying that we don't need fire suppression. We do. I personally live right next, like I can see the Coconino National Forest right there. And I don't personally want, and you can see a tiny bit back there, I don't want my house to burn down, right? I would like to maintain power. There are places where we need to protect those human assets and resources.
Yes.
But that is not a strategy for everywhere. We need to really think about lower cost, ecological restoration style work to really work on the crisis that's out there and fight the fire and suppress it here on the boundary with that forest.
So perhaps thinning is really changing the density of trees, within a given area, which nature doesn't really do. But what nature does do is it has natural barriers and boundaries to different tree stands where they're isolated from each other. And those isolations, those naturally occurring barriers, are what stops, widespread canopy fires.
Exactly,
so
and there's some cool examples.
Rather than thinning an area, we should go in and harvest selectively. But harvesting trees is good, right? There's no shortage of trees wanting to make more trees.
Right.
And when we harvest them and turn them into lumber, that carbon is sequestered as long as the 2x4s in your house are standing.
Exactly.
But if you leave them out there and they catch fire, then you've lost the opportunity to sequester all that carbon.
Definitely. And I think, if we think about the carbon cost of restoration efforts, the biggest opportunity, the low-hanging fruit here is right now, common practice is you pile and burn all that fuel, and you immediately send it up to the atmosphere. And we can make biochar, we can make harvested wood products, we can even do, there's some really cool projects between the National Forest Foundation and the Navajo Reservation, which is close to Flagstaff, around just even fuel source, because a lot of those communities don't have energy. So that's like a quicker release, but still it's replacing someone driving out and getting a propane tank, right? There's ways to use that biomass that are so much more efficient than piling it, especially when, I'm going to get back to that pile. I'm going to get back to it. And then a fire hits and, we don't get to pick the conditions that we want for, wildfire or unplanned fire. But I think the other point that you made around those natural breaks, I think that's actually part of the solution here too. So it's, how do we do treatments to remove some of that fuel and create a natural fire break? But there's also animals and other ecosystems and natural processes that do the same thing. Beavers being a great example. They actually create these natural fire breaks where when they build a dam, they're essentially creating a bunch of moisture. They're creating this sort of boundary where there's not fuel, and fires that hit beaver dam analogs a little bit, but also true beaver habitat, it acts like a fire break. Isn't that cool? Beavers can do it for us. Not all of it, but some of it.
Right. Fire Chief Beaver.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Smokey the Beaver.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to, new animal, right? So
new mascot.
Right. So if we want to use, the free market economy and the forces of economy to, for good, then one thing we would do is we would create a market for biomass that's not otherwise usable, right? When we do trimming, or we're thinning small trees that don't have a great lumber potential, rather than burning them, right? As you said, create biochar, creates pellets for people's stoves, even, create more demand for toilet paper and paper towels, right? Things that can be
Hmm.
made from this material. So this idea that we had previously, like, oh, don't use paper towel, save a towel, whatever, save a towel, save a tree.
Right.
Like the problem is, we're not running out of trees. We're running out of things to do with the trees that we have, so that we can harvest, enough of them to protect the forests.
I 100% agree. I'm a child of the 80s, so I lived through the like paper towels and paper killing forests.
Right.
That's
No.
that's far too simple, right?
So paper or plastic, choose paper.
Right. Exactly, because the best thing we can do for the Western US is to revive our rural forest economies. So I grew up in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, Washington, called Aberdeen, Washington. And our little tagline when you enter the town is, it says, the lumber capital of the world, right? Because back in the early 1900s, we were shipping out tons and tons and tons of timber. I say that because the answer, so if that paper towel is made out of a really healthy old growth ponderosa pine, that's not a good paper towel.
Right.
But we have so much biomass and fuel out there that is basically a driver of this process. It's actually causing that drought-induced mortality. It's causing that high severity fire behavior. We need to start looking at sustainable harvest and fuel reduction treatments through the lens of, look at all this free biomass that we could turn into things that we need, right? Why are we leaving it out there on the forest? I think it's challenging because a lot of that biomass is in a sort of diameter class or form that is harder to use. But I have been cheering on all of the work that I've seen in the last 10 years around that small diameter wood utilization. Everything from biochar to bioenergy to laminate and like mass timber and things like this, where we're trying to come up with creative uses for some of this material, where, the timber industry of the early 1910s in the town that I was in was really around like saw logs,
Right. So it's creating markets for the non-saw log trees, right? The small diameter timbers, the
Yeah.
brush. What do you have any ideas on the use of various types of mushrooms and mycologies as ways to break down, um, brush and tinder and logs laying on the ground as a labor multiplier? It's hard to, you're not going to go out and drag every twig out of the forest floor, but you could spray, mycelium on there that would then decompose it back into usable soil.
I think that's incredibly essential. I think there's two really interesting sort of mycological solutions out there. But before we go there, so why would we need this? Well, because fire historically cycled a bunch of nutrients, right? It was this recycler of all of those terpenes and all those nutrients that were in needles or leaves. And through removing fire from ecosystems, we actually have massively degraded soil health and soil nutrient availability. So what you're talking about is like, how do we actually take all this litter and duff and kind of replenish that soil, which ends up benefiting the remaining forests. It ends up reducing fuels, things like that. I think the other technology that I'm fascinated with is the inoculation of seedlings with like different microbial communities that actually help them sort of root and survive, especially post-fire. Because when we have a high severity fire, we often kind of bake that soil and there's a lack of canopy cover, and it's really hard for those seedlings to survive, essentially. And so I'm really intrigued by some of that mycological inoculation of seedlings where there's a lack of seed source, and we probably do need to go re-enter that burn scar and put new seedlings in the ground. So I think there's, mushrooms are fascinating. I love them. And I think that they are part of the solution.
And are there certain, I don't know if this is probably not your field, but are there strains that are more beneficial or will be more rapidly effective at breaking down small diameter timbers?
That is definitely outside of my realm. But there is a really, so this one,
We'll go to London, we'll go to England and we'll speak to them about that, right?
yeah, I know there's lots of cool people in this space. Around the mycological inoculation, there's a cool startup called Funga that's working on that. And there's two of them that are working on two different ones that are working on the decomposition of fuels, but I don't have those names at the top of mind.
Yeah. One of the really fun things about talking with you as a scientist is that is your propensity to not just examine the problem, but to, be jumping towards solutions, right? That there's a fundamental optimism within scientists, even when the data that you're looking at is depressing.
There are days where you look at the data and you just kind of you just take a deep breath, because it can look a little bit like, it can look a little Chicken Little-y, but we can't get stymied by inaction. And we can't, we have to keep moving. We have to keep exploring. We also, I definitely have a sort of part of my mind that has hope that, we as humans don't fully understand ecosystems, processes, things like that. Nature, like we talked about, efficient at sequestering carbon, also has all sorts of other cool adaptations. So I kind of decided to live on the side of the fence, which is that we can work together. We can take what we know and help restore some of these ecosystems and let them do what they do well. And that's kind of how I don't get stuck in a depressive cycle of the world is ending, right? Because that's not a good place to live, and it's not really useful to the communities that I live in or care about, that I want to help, that I'm working with. Saying, oh well, I was on a different podcast a number of years ago after I published a temperature tipping point paper, and the reporter said, so basically we should just the Amazon is screwed and we should just move on. And I was like, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. And I never did say that. I was like, we need to restore and work with these ecosystems. We need to help them be resilient. I think that's our best bet. Let's work with nature, not against it. Let's understand what it needs, and let's understand how we can help.
Well, it's not really a big choice, right? We either work with nature or nature works against us. Mm-hmm. Right. Do you want to be friends with nature or enemies?
Right. So an example being...
Because it's going to win in the end, right? So
yeah.
You may as well be on its side.
Yeah, example being, we're like, oh, we don't want fire. Well, 150 years later, or not quite 150, but 100 years later, let's call it that.
Yeah.
Where are we? Well, nature's like, well, listen, I'm going to build a bunch more fuel out there. And
right.
Now you get to pay the cost of what you did. Now you get to pay your fire debt.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. If folks want to follow up on your latest stories and the work that you're doing, what's the best way to follow you?
Yeah, I would probably direct them to vibrantplanet.net, or just Google Vibrant Planet. My science team, we've been first we have a couple of papers coming out, but we're also coming out with a bunch of blog posts and things like that to help kind of lay people understand and interpret and hear our perspectives on various different ecosystem services and ecosystem dynamics, everything from fire severity and fire return interval departure to carbon storage and water security and biodiversity. And so we're in the process of crafting a bunch of these white papers, blogs, and manuscripts. And so Vibrant Planet is the best place to go look for those.
Awesome. That's nice of you to direct our viewers and listeners there, and what a great resource. And by the way, folks, if you're listening to this and it sounds like, science over your head, it's not, right? Perhaps it's the vocabulary, but the concepts are pretty simple, and you're made out of these concepts. So, you're wired to understand them if somebody puts it in your language. So I think that what you'll see at Vibrant Planet is taking these concepts that are often expressed initially by scientists in science language and put into plain English, or if you don't speak English, whatever your language is. So, Katharyn, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Steve. It was a riot.
Absolutely. Well, we should do this again because I have a feeling that a month from now there'll still be just as much to talk about when we're trying to figure out how to help make our planet more conducive to us, which is really what we care about, right? When we seem to forget that. Now, folks, we've been listening to Dr. Katharyn Duffy here. Check her out with Vibrant Planet, interesting source of research on how we can keep our planet more habitable. You've been watching and listening to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. Take care, and we'll see you at the next one.